What if one of Napoleon Bonaparte's greatest victories wasn't won on the battlefield? She was 19 years old, married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, living in a country that no longer existed on any map. And then, the most powerful man in Europe noticed her. History remembers her as Napoleon's mistress. But what if that's the least important part of the story? What if she didn't love him at all? What if she used him? What if one woman's body helped bring an entire nation back from the dead? Marie Walewska wasn't chasing romance. She was bargaining with an empire behind closed doors. While cannons roared across Europe, a young Polish countess made a choice that would change history. A choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. This is not a love story. It's a story about power, sacrifice, and the price of turning yourself into a weapon. And once you hear what she gave up, you'll never look at Napoleon the same way again. Marie Walewska was born on December 7, 1786, in the quiet village of Kiernocea, in the heart of central Poland. Snow covered the fields that winter, settling gently over wooden roofs and frozen roads. To the villagers, it was just another cold morning. To history, it was the birth of a girl whose life would be shaped not by peace, but by absence, because Marie was born into a country that was already dying. 14 years earlier, in 1772, Poland had been torn apart for the first time. Prussia, Russia, and the Austrian Empire, three great powers with armies, gold, and ambition, had agreed that Poland was weak enough to be divided. Borders were redrawn in distant capitals by men who would never walk Polish soil. Land was taken, authority erased, and a sovereign nation was reduced to a problem to be managed. By the time Marie learned to walk, Poland had been partitioned again and again. By the end of her childhood, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth no longer existed at all. No flag, no king, no voice. Poland survived only in memory, language, and grief. Marie, however, was born into privilege. Her father, Count Mateusz Łączyński, was a wealthy landowner and a respected member of the Polish nobility. Her mother, Eva, came from an equally established aristocratic family. Their estate was large, elegant, and orderly, an island of refinement in a world slipping into chaos from the outside. Marie's early life seemed protected. She grew up surrounded by servants, tutors, and the rituals of the upper class. She wore fine clothes. She was taught manners, music, and languages. The walls around her were thick. But history has a way of seeping through even stone. Conversations at dinner were never just about crops or guests. They were about loss, about betrayal, about a nation humiliated and carved up like property. Marie did not yet understand the words, but she understood the tone, the quiet rage, the bitterness her elders carried like a second spine. Her father was not a man who accepted defeat. When the third partition of Poland sparked open resistance in 1794, Count Mateusz Łączyński did not remain safely behind his estate walls. Like many Polish nobles, he joined the uprising against foreign domination. It was a desperate struggle, ill-equipped, outnumbered, and already doomed, but it was fueled by something stronger than logic. Dignity. That same year, at the Battle of Maciejowice, he was killed. Marie was not yet 8 years old. Death arrived not with warning, but with permanence. One day her father was a presence, his voice, his boots on the floor, his authority unquestioned. The next, he was a name spoken in past tense. The estate grew quieter. Her mother wore black, and Marie learned, too early, that loyalty to a lost country could cost everything. The death of her father marked the end of her innocence. It also sealed the political identity of the Łączyński children. Marie and her siblings did not grow up merely as aristocrats. They grew up as Polish patriots. Their nationalism was not loud or theatrical. It was private, internalized, and painful. They did not dream of conquest. They dreamed of restoration, despite the family's status. The loss of their patriarch weakened them, without her father's influence and protection. Their finances and political standing slowly eroded. The world beyond the estate gates grew harsher, more uncertain. The future was no longer guaranteed, yet Marie's education did not stop. If anything, it intensified. She was taught French, the language of diplomacy and power, by Nicolas Chopin, a cultured man whose son, Frédéric, would one day become one of the greatest composers in history. Marie proved to be intelligent, observant, and quietly self-contained. She listened more than she spoke. She absorbed more than she revealed. Those who met her later would describe her beauty. But beauty was not her most dangerous trait. It was her restraint, her ability to endure without protest. By adolescence, Marie had learned the unspoken rules of her world, that women were assets, that marriages were transactions, and that personal desire ranked far below family survival. She also learned something more subtle, that in a world ruled by empires, even weakness could be turned into leverage. Poland had been erased by force, but Marie was growing up at a moment when power was shifting across Europe. One name was rising faster than any army could march: Napoleon Bonaparte. Marie did not know it yet, but the story of her life and the fate of her country was already moving toward him. She was a girl born into loss, but history had not finished with her after her father's death. The world Marie Walewska grew into was quieter, but heavier. The estate at Kiernozia still stood. Its gates still opened each morning, its halls still polished and orderly. Servants continued their routines. Tutors arrived on schedule. From the outside, nothing appeared broken, but inside the household, something essential was missing: certainty. Marie's mother, Eva, carried grief with discipline. She did not collapse. She reorganized. In an era where survival depended on control, emotion was a luxury she could not afford. The family's mourning became structured, restrained, almost ceremonial. Black dresses, controlled voices, silence where laughter once lived. For Marie, childhood did not end abruptly. It narrowed. She was raised to observe before speaking, to understand before reacting. Loss had taught her that the world was not fair, but predictable in one cruel way. Power always decided outcomes. Those without it learned to adapt or disappear. Her education reflected this reality. Marie's days were filled with lessons designed to mold her into a woman worthy of aristocratic survival. She studied French fluently, absorbing the language of diplomacy, culture, and command. French was more than a tongue. It was access. It was the language spoken by those who ruled Europe, by generals and kings, by men who moved borders with signatures. She learned music and etiquette, history and literature. But history, for Marie, was never abstract. It lived in the spaces where Poland should have been. It lived in stories told in lowered voices about betrayals, crushed rebellions, and promises broken by foreign courts. The Polish nobility, stripped of sovereignty, existed in a strange limbo. They were still wealthy, still educated, still proud, but no longer in control of their own fate. Their estates remained, but their authority was conditional. Their future depended not on loyalty to a crown, but on strategic alignment with whichever empire held power that year. Marie absorbed this lesson without needing it explained. As she entered adolescence, she began to understand her role in this fragile system. Beauty, intelligence, lineage, these were not personal gifts. They were resources, tools, means of negotiation in her world. Daughters were not simply raised, they were prepared for marriage, prepared for sacrifice. She was aware of her own appearance, not with vanity, but with caution. People noticed her. She drew glances at gatherings, subtle pauses in conversation, the slight shift in tone when her name was spoken. She learned to keep her expression calm, her eyes lowered. Attention, she understood, could be both protection and threat, despite the decay of Polish political power. Nationalist sentiment only grew stronger among families like the Łączyńskis. Marie's siblings shared this quiet fire. They spoke of a future Poland not as fantasy, but as destiny delayed. France, in particular, became the object of their hope. The French Revolution had shaken Europe. The old order was cracking, and from that chaos, a new force was rising. Napoleon Bonaparte. To many Poles, Napoleon represented more than a general. He was disruption, possibility, the kind of man who humiliated kings and redrew maps. If anyone could restore Poland, or at least weaken its oppressors, it would be him. Marie listened to these conversations carefully. She did not yet know how deeply Napoleon would enter her life, but she sensed the gravity of his name. It was spoken with urgency, with expectation. He was not admired for kindness, but for effectiveness. In that distinction, Marie recognized a truth she would one day live by. As the years passed, the family's financial position grew more strained. Without her father's leadership, debts accumulated, influence faded, the security of aristocratic life began to crack. And with that instability came pressure, unspoken at first, then increasingly direct. Marie was approaching marriageable age. Suitors were discussed not in terms of affection, but advantage, connections, stability, preservation. Her future was no longer her own to imagine. It was a solution to a problem her family needed to solve. She did not protest, not outwardly, by the time she turned 18. Marie had learned how to endure quietly, how to accept decisions made for her without revealing resistance. She understood that open defiance rarely changed outcomes. Influence, however subtle, patient influence, could. She was growing into a woman shaped by restraint, intelligence, and a profound understanding of power dynamics. A woman who knew that survival did not belong to the loudest voice, but to the one who waited for the right moment. Poland was gone. Her father was gone. Her freedom was narrowing, and yet, unknowingly, Marie was preparing for the most dangerous role of her life. Not as a rebel, not as a soldier, but as something far more unsettling to empires. A woman who would learn how to make herself indispensable. By 1804, the question was no longer if Marie Łączyńska would be married, but to whom, and how much that marriage could save. The Łączyńska family had reached the edge of its endurance. Years without political power had drained their finances. Debts accumulated quietly. Then, all at once, influence that once protected them now belonged to others. In the new Europe shaped by empires, noble lineage alone was no longer enough. Marie was 18 years old when the decision was made. Her mother, Eva, did not frame it as cruelty. She framed it as necessity. The man chosen was Athanasius, Count Walewski. He was 68, nearly 4 times Marie's age. Count Walewski was a relic of the old Polish order, a man who had once held significant political influence at the court of the last king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Stanisław August Poniatowski. He represented stability, connections, and above all, survival. Through him, the family could regain security. Through Marie, the alliance would be sealed. No one asked her if she loved him. Love was irrelevant. On the day of the wedding, observers noted the contrast with uncomfortable clarity. Marie was described as the melancholy little bride, bereft of feeling. She stood pale and composed, her expression controlled, her posture flawless. Her husband, meanwhile, was described as the old gentleman, beaming with self-satisfaction. The marriage was not a union, it was a transaction, with a single ceremony. Marie Walewska ceased to exist as an individual and became Countess Walewska. Her name changed, her body became duty-bound, her future was reassigned. She entered a life she had not chosen, bound to a man who viewed her less as a partner and more as proof that time had not defeated him. The age difference was impossible to ignore, where Marie's youth was quiet and restrained. Walewski's presence was heavy, authoritative, and entitled. He did not see her inner conflict, or perhaps he did, and dismissed it as irrelevant. Marriage did not free Marie from politics. It pulled her deeper into them. As Countess Walewska, she gained access to circles that mattered, salons where Polish nobles gathered, conversations where resentment toward Prussia and Russia simmered beneath polite language, rooms where France was spoken of not as a country, but as a potential savior. Walewski himself was deeply embedded in Polish nationalist networks. Through him, Marie was surrounded by men who believed Poland could still be reborn if the right alliance was formed, if the right power could be persuaded. She listened. She learned. Shortly after the marriage, Marie gave birth to a son, Antoni Rudolf. The child brought her a new title, mother, but even this role was shaped by restraint. She fulfilled her duties with care, but without illusion. Motherhood did not soften the reality of her situation. If anything, it deepened her awareness of what was at stake. Her life became structured, predictable, and emotionally distant. Count Walewski was not cruel. He was something colder, indifferent to her inner world. He expected obedience, gratitude, and appearances. Marie provided all three. She learned how to disappear into politeness, how to remain present without being seen. Outwardly, she was everything expected of a countess. Inwardly, she was watching history shift across Europe. Old alliances were collapsing. Monarchies trembled. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, was no longer just a revolutionary state. It was an empire in motion. His armies crushed Austria, humbled Prussia, and challenged Russia itself. Every victory rearranged the balance of power for Poles. This was not distant news. It was hope. In Warsaw and beyond, whispers spread. Napoleon might march east. Napoleon might defeat Poland's oppressors. Napoleon might restore what had been lost. The idea electrified nationalist circles. Plans were discussed, strategies imagined, influence became currency. Marie did not speak much in these gatherings. She did not need to. She was young, beautiful, and perfectly positioned, married into the right networks, fluent in the language of power, and already accustomed to sacrificing herself for causes larger than her own happiness. What she did not yet realize was that her life had been narrowing toward a single point. A moment, a meeting, a man whose ambition matched the scale of history itself. Marie Walewska had already been traded once. by her family, by circumstance, by a dead nation's desperation. Soon, she would be asked to trade herself again. This time, the price would not be financial security. It would be history. Marriage did not quiet Marie Walewska's world. It sharpened it, as Countess Walewska. She moved through life with a new title and a heavier silence. The salons she entered were more refined, the conversations more careful, but beneath the velvet and etiquette, the same tension vibrated. Poland was still gone, and everyone in the room knew it. Warsaw at the beginning of the 19th century was a city suspended between obedience and rebellion. Officially, it bent under foreign rule. Unofficially, it seethed. Polish nobles gathered in drawing rooms, not to celebrate, but to remember, to calculate, to wait. Marie sat among them, often quietly, her presence decorative on the surface. Yet decoration was never neutral. She was young, beautiful, and married to a man whose past influence still carried weight. People watched her. Men spoke more carefully when she was near. Information moved differently around her. She began to understand that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it listened. Her husband, Count Walewski, remained connected to nationalist circles. He spoke openly of the past, of kings, of sovereignty, of what Poland had been before it was dismantled. He believed restoration was still possible, though he did not know how. Marie noticed that the men around him argued not about whether Poland should return, but who could make it happen, again and again. The answer was the same. France. Napoleon Bonaparte had transformed from revolutionary general to emperor with breathtaking speed. He defeated Austria. He crushed Prussia. He humiliated old monarchies that had ruled Europe for centuries, to Poles. This mattered more than ideology. Napoleon was proof that the old order could be broken, and if it could be broken, then perhaps it could be reshaped. Marie absorbed these discussions without interruption. She was learning the unspoken grammar of influence: who spoke, who listened, who decided. She noticed how men leaned forward when France was mentioned, how hope made them reckless, how desperation made them willing to compromise morals they publicly defended. She also noticed something else. None of them could reach Napoleon. Letters went unanswered. Envoys were ignored. Declarations of loyalty disappeared into bureaucracy. Poland was important to Napoleon only when it served him, and until recently, it had not. Marie understood this intuitively. Empires did not move out of sympathy. They moved out of advantage. At home, her life remained controlled and emotionally distant. Count Walewski expected decorum, gratitude, and heirs. He had no interest in her thoughts, her fears, or her intelligence, unless they reflected well on him. Marie learned to separate her inner life from her public one completely. She performed her role flawlessly. And yet, beneath that performance, something was forming. Marie was beginning to realize that she occupied a rare position. She was close enough to power to observe it, yet distant enough to remain underestimated. She was not a general, not a diplomat, not a statesman. She was a woman in a world that rarely considered women dangerous. That invisibility would become her greatest asset. When news reached Warsaw that Napoleon's armies were moving east, toward Prussian-controlled territories and into lands once Polish, the atmosphere changed overnight. Conversations grew urgent, eyes lit with expectation. For the first time in years, hope felt tangible. Napoleon was coming closer. Marie felt it not as excitement, but as pressure. Something in her life, already tightly constrained, was being pulled toward a point she could not yet see. She did not know when she would meet him. She did not even know if she ever would. But she knew one thing with growing clarity. If Poland were to be reborn, it would not be through speeches or petitions. It would be through proximity, and proximity required access. Marie Walewska had already learned how to endure sacrifice. Soon, she would learn how to weaponize it. By the winter of 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer a distant name spoken in salons. He was moving, and Europe was rearranging itself in his path, after crushing the Austrian Empire and forcing Vienna to submit. Napoleon turned north and east. Prussia declared war, and lost it with stunning speed. Berlin fell. The Prussian king fled. French armies poured across territories that had once belonged to Poland, marching through lands where sovereignty had been erased, but memory remained sharp. For the Polish people, Napoleon's arrival was not merely military, it was symbolic. French uniforms marching across Polish soil felt like a return of agency. However fragile, nobles welcomed officers into their homes. Bells rang, streets filled. Hope, long suppressed, rose dangerously fast. Warsaw became electric. Marie Walewska watched the city transform almost overnight. Where there had been caution, there was now anticipation. Where there had been whispered conversations, there were plans. Polish nationalists believed, some desperately, some naively, that Napoleon might restore Poland as a political entity if enough loyalty were shown. The question was how to reach him. Napoleon traveled surrounded by layers of command, aides, generals, guards, bureaucrats. He did not grant audiences easily. He did not waste time on sentiment. Every interaction was filtered through purpose. Marie understood this instinctively. The stories of their first encounter varied even among contemporaries. Some claimed it was accidental, a roadside inn where Napoleon stopped to change horses. And Marie happened to be present. Others insisted it was deliberate, that Polish nationalists arranged the meeting, or that Marie herself requested it through intermediaries. There were even accounts suggesting the meeting never happened at all. But history agrees on one thing. Napoleon noticed her, whether she handed him flowers or merely stood among a gathering of nobles. She left an impression strong enough that he asked who she was. In a world where Napoleon rarely forgot faces and rarely cared to remember them, that mattered. Soon after, at a formal gathering of Polish elites in Warsaw, Napoleon saw Marie again. This time, he did not let her pass unnoticed. He instructed his staff that he wished to speak with her shortly afterward. 2 notes arrived: admiring, personal, unmistakably interested. Marie did not reply. Her silence was not flirtation. It was fear. Napoleon Bonaparte was not simply a man. He was power incarnate, volatile, absolute, and indifferent to individual consequence. To attract his attention was dangerous. To respond to it could be catastrophic. Marie was a married woman, a Catholic, a Polish countess living under scrutiny. But her silence only increased his curiosity. Accounts differ sharply on Marie's feelings during this period. Some historians argue she was intrigued by Napoleon, drawn to his charisma and intellect. Others insist she was terrified, pressured relentlessly by her family and nationalist circles who saw in her an opportunity too valuable to waste. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. Marie was not immune to admiration, but admiration was not her motivation. Around her, the pressure mounted. Friends spoke of duty. Family members spoke of sacrifice. Polish leaders spoke of history watching. They did not ask her what she wanted. They told her what was required. To refuse Napoleon was to refuse Poland's last real chance. To accept him meant violating her marriage, her faith, and her sense of self. Marie resisted as long as she could, but resistance, she had learned, rarely changed outcomes. It only delayed them. When the relationship finally began, it was kept discreet, at least officially. Warsaw's elite knew. Rumors spread quickly in a city starving for significance. But Napoleon remained cautious. He understood optics. He also understood value. Their time together grew gradually, cautiously, and despite its origin in pressure and strategy, something unexpected emerged. Affection. Napoleon, who cycled through mistresses without attachment, lingered with Marie. He spoke to her of politics, of Poland, of Europe. He listened when she spoke, something rare even among his generals. Marie, for her part, discovered that the emperor was not merely ruthless, but complex, driven, insecure, obsessive, capable of tenderness when it suited him. For months, Napoleon remained in Poland, finishing the war against Prussia and Russia. When the Treaty of Tilsit was signed in 1807, ending the War of the Fourth Coalition, the consequences were enormous. Prussia was stripped of vast territories. Borders shifted again, and out of those territories, Napoleon created something that had not existed for over a decade, the Duchy of Warsaw, to the Polish people. It was a miracle, a state in name, if not fully sovereign, a promise, if not fulfillment, and to many. Marie Walewska was seen as part of that miracle, whether fairly or not. Napoleon returned to Paris later that year. Before leaving, he sent Marie gifts, books, a portrait of himself, and a letter that revealed more than strategy. "My gentle and dear Marie," he wrote, "you who love your country so much will understand the joy I feel at being back in France. This joy would be complete had you been here too, but I carry you in my heart." Marie read the words carefully. She had achieved what others could not. Poland existed again, if only partially. The sacrifice, she told herself, had meaning. And yet, as the distance between them grew, a dangerous question lingered in her mind. Had she been using Napoleon? Or had Napoleon been using her all along? The creation of the Duchy of Warsaw was announced with ceremony, proclamations, and carefully chosen words on paper. It was a political construct carved from Prussian territory, bound to France, governed under Napoleon's influence. In reality, it was something far more fragile. It was hope given form. For the Polish people, the duchy was proof that their country had not been forgotten by history. Bells rang in cities and villages alike. Flags, long hidden, reappeared. Men spoke openly again of Poland not as memory, but as future, and in whispered conversations. One name surfaced again and again beside Napoleon's: Marie Walewska. She did not ask for this role. It was assigned to her by rumor, by gratitude, by a desperate need to believe that sacrifice had meaning. To some, she was a heroine, a woman who had softened the heart of an emperor. To others, she was something darker, a symbol of compromise, of morality bent under political pressure. Marie herself accepted neither title. She understood too well how the duchy had been born. Napoleon had not restored Poland out of love. He had done it because it served him, because Polish soldiers were loyal, because the state would act as a buffer against Russia, because it strengthened French dominance in Eastern Europe. Marie's influence, if it existed at all, was only one thread in a far larger design, and yet she could not deny that she had spoken to him. Not in grand speeches, not in demands, but in moments, quiet conversations where she described her father's death, her country's erasure, the humiliation of living as a nation without a name. She spoke not as a politician, but as a witness. Napoleon listened. Whether out of affection or calculation, she could not tell. Perhaps it did not matter. After Napoleon returned to Paris, Marie was left in a strange position. She had achieved what her family and compatriots had hoped for, but the cost lingered in her body and conscience. She was still married, still bound by social expectations, still watched, and she was alone. Letters arrived from France, warm, personal, possessive. Napoleon did not forget her easily. He wrote as a man accustomed to being obeyed, yet oddly vulnerable in tone. He spoke of carrying her in his heart, of understanding her love for Poland, of longing. Marie read every word with care, but she answered cautiously. In her private writings, memoirs she would complete before her death, she attempted to explain herself, to justify the path she had taken, to frame her actions as necessity rather than desire. The sacrifice was complete. She wrote, "It was all about harvesting fruit now, achieving this one single equivalence, which could excuse my debased position. This thought ruled over my will." She insisted that she had not loved Napoleon, that she had endured him for Poland, that her conscience, though wounded, remained intact because the outcome justified the means. But history is rarely satisfied with explanations written after the fact. Those who knew her noticed contradictions. Marie did not behave like a woman entirely untouched by emotion. She kept Napoleon's letters. She spoke of him with restraint, but not indifference. When he called for her again, years later, she would go. The truth was more unsettling than either version allowed. Marie had entered the relationship under pressure. That much was undeniable. She had been urged, guided, and morally cornered by those who saw her as a bridge to power. But once inside that world, once she stood face to face with the man who bent Europe to his will, something shifted. Napoleon was not merely an emperor. He was intensity incarnate. He demanded loyalty, admiration, attention, and he gave, in return, focus. A rare and intoxicating thing. Marie, who had lived her entire life being overlooked as an individual, suddenly found herself listened to. That did not mean she loved him, but it meant she was no longer untouched. As months passed, the Duchy of Warsaw struggled under the weight of reality. It was dependent on France, vulnerable to Russia, and uncertain of its future. Marie watched this with growing unease. Had she given herself for something that could vanish as easily as it had appeared? The question haunted her. She had become a symbol without consent, a political myth wrapped around a private wound. Poland praised her. Society judged her. Napoleon desired her, and she stood in the center of it all, increasingly aware that no outcome would restore what she had lost. She had traded certainty for influence, virtue for possibility, and a quiet life for history's attention. The machinery of empire moved on relentlessly. Napoleon prepared for new wars, new alliances, new marriages. Marie, for all her significance, remained peripheral, useful, cherished, but never central to power. Yet their story was not finished, because Napoleon would return east once more, and when he did, Marie Walewska would face the consequences of a choice she could no longer pretend had been purely political. History did not pause for reflection. By 1809, Europe was once again at war, and Napoleon Bonaparte was once again marching east. The War of the Fifth Coalition drew him back into Central Europe. where Austria, humbled before, rose again in defiance. Vienna fell for the second time in less than 5 years, and Napoleon installed himself in the imperial capital as if it were merely another room in his vast dominion. For Marie Walewska, the news carried a meaning far more personal than political. Napoleon was close again. 2 years had passed since his departure from Poland. In that time, Marie's life had settled into a fragile imitation of normalcy. She remained married to Count Walewski, still fulfilling her role with precision and emotional distance. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. She was no longer the woman she had been before Napoleon. The letters had never truly stopped. They had slowed, become irregular, but they never vanished. And when word arrived, clear and unmistakable, that Napoleon wished to see her, Marie understood that refusal was no longer an option. This time, no one needed to pressure her. She traveled south from the Duchy of Warsaw to Vienna under the cover of propriety. Her movements justified as familial or social obligation, but everyone who mattered understood the truth. The past was being resumed, not remembered. When Marie arrived in Vienna, Napoleon received her not as a conquest, but as a familiarity. The distance between them vanished with unsettling ease. He spoke to her as if no time had passed, as if the wars, the treaties, the shifting alliances were merely interruptions. For Napoleon, continuity was power. For Marie, it was surrender. The relationship resumed with a different tone than before. In Poland, it had been cautious, politically charged, restrained by uncertainty. In Vienna, it was intimate, insistent, and less apologetic. Napoleon was at the height of his authority. He no longer needed to persuade. Marie sensed the imbalance immediately. She was still young, barely in her early 20s, but the years had aged her inwardly. She no longer told herself comforting stories about sacrifice and necessity. She understood now that her role was not temporary. She was not a means to an end. She was an attachment, and attachments, in Napoleon's world, were controlled. During these weeks in Vienna, Marie became pregnant. There was no ceremony to the moment, no dramatic revelation, only a quiet certainty that settled over her with terrifying clarity. She carried within her not just a child, but proof, irrefutable and dangerous, of her connection to the emperor. She did not tell Napoleon immediately. She returned to Poland with her secret carefully guarded, aware that its implications extended far beyond herself. A child could not be undone. A child could not be hidden forever. And a child, if recognized, could shift dynastic realities. In early May 1810, Marie gave birth to a boy. He was named Alexander Florian Joseph. Count Walewski acknowledged the child as his own. Officially, Alexander was legitimate. Socially, the question of his parentage hovered unspoken, yet unavoidable. Those who knew Marie, who had seen Napoleon's attention toward her, did not need confirmation. The resemblance would come later. At first, Marie focused on survival. She had given birth not only to a son, but to a liability. In a Europe obsessed with lineage, heirs, and legitimacy, Alexander represented possibility and threat in equal measure. If Napoleon claimed him, everything would change. If he did not, the child would live in ambiguity, protected, but unacknowledged. Napoleon, meanwhile, had returned to Paris. There, he made a decision that would redefine Marie's place in his life forever. He divorced Josephine de Beauharnais. The marriage had failed to produce a legitimate heir, and Napoleon's ambitions demanded continuity. Soon after, he married Marie Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor, a union designed to secure dynastic legitimacy and political stability. for Marie Walewska. The message was unmistakable. Whatever she had been to Napoleon, confidant, instrument, affection, she would never be empress. And yet, he did not abandon her. Napoleon ensured that Marie and her son were housed comfortably, provided for generously, and kept close, though never too close. She was settled in a grand residence, shielded from scandal, insulated from need, taken care of. It was a kindness that felt like erasure. Marie understood now the final shape of her sacrifice. She had not changed history out of love, nor had she secured Poland's future. She had given herself to a man who valued her, but only within limits defined by power. She had borne him a son, but not an heir, and in doing so, she had placed herself beyond restoration. The empire continued to expand. Plans were made for a campaign against Russia. Napoleon prepared for the greatest gamble of his career. Marie watched from the margins, holding a child whose existence connected her irrevocably to the rise and eventual fall of an empire. She had once believed sacrifice would bring clarity. Instead, it brought permanence. By 1812, Marie Walewska understood that proximity to power did not guarantee protection from it. Napoleon's empire stood at its widest reach, stretching from Spain to the edges of Eastern Europe. On maps, France dominated the continent. In reality, the foundations were already cracking. Every victory demanded another war. Every alliance bred resentment, and every promise made to smaller nations was conditional, temporary, and reversible. The Duchy of Warsaw still existed, but uneasily. It depended entirely on Napoleon's favor, and favor, Marie had learned, was never permanent. Her own life was changing as well. Count Athanasius Walewski was old, frail, and increasingly irrelevant in the world he once navigated with confidence. Their marriage had long since ceased to be a partnership of any kind. It had become an arrangement maintained out of habit and appearances. Marie no longer needed that protection. In 1812, she divorced him. The decision was quiet, legal, and final, as part of the settlement. Marie and her eldest son received half of the Count's estates, still substantial, though burdened with debt. For the first time in her life, Marie possessed something close to independence. Not freedom, perhaps, but agency. She was no longer a bargaining chip. Yet the timing could not have been more ominous. That same year, Napoleon marched east once again, this time into Russia. The invasion was vast, unprecedented, and reckless. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed into hostile territory under the assumption that force alone could bend reality. Marie watched the preparations with dread. Napoleon passed through Polish lands as he assembled the Grand Army. Some accounts suggest that Marie and Napoleon met again during this period. If they did, it was not romantic. The man she had once known, intense, focused, seemingly invincible, was now consumed by ambition on a scale that bordered on delusion. He was preparing to challenge winter, distance, and an empire that refused to submit. She understood what this meant before most others did. Power, when overstretched, breaks. The Russian campaign ended in catastrophe. The army that marched in triumph returned in fragments. Soldiers froze, horses collapsed, discipline disintegrated. Europe watched as the myth of Napoleon's invincibility shattered in real time. With the army's collapse came rebellion. Allies defected, enemies regrouped. The empire began to unravel. In 1814, Napoleon abdicated for Marie. The news arrived not as shock, but confirmation. History had caught up to inevitability. The man who had redrawn Europe was now being escorted into exile, stripped of the authority that had once made every door open. He was sent to Elba, and Marie made a decision that surprised even those closest to her. She traveled to join him. Why she did so remains debated. Some believe Napoleon's financial arrangements toward her had faltered, and she went to secure what had been promised. Others argue something simpler and more human, that she felt bound to him by shared history, by their son, by the knowledge that no one else fully understood what they had been to each other. Perhaps it was both. On Elba, Napoleon was no longer emperor in any meaningful sense. He ruled a small island surrounded by watchful eyes, his grandeur reduced to routine. Marie saw him not as history saw him, but as a man facing irrelevance. Their reunion was brief. When Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France for what would become the 100 Days, Marie did not follow. The spell had broken. Whatever obligation she felt, to him or to the past, had reached its limit. After Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated once and for all. He abdicated again, this time permanently, and was exiled to St. Helena, far beyond reach, far beyond return. Marie never saw him again, with Napoleon gone. The world shifted brutally fast. The Duchy of Warsaw collapsed along with his empire. Poland, once again, vanished into diplomatic compromise. The dream she had sacrificed so much for dissolved without ceremony. There would be no restoration, no reward proportional to the cost. Marie was left standing among the ruins, alive, independent, and disillusioned, for the first time. Her life was no longer defined by proximity to power. There were no emperors to appease, no nations to bargain for, no roles imposed upon her by desperate men. There was only the question she had avoided for most of her life. Who was she? Without history pressing her into service, the answer would come unexpectedly, through love. At last, chosen rather than demanded, but it would come too late to save her. When the noise of history finally receded, what remained was silence. In 1815, Count Athanasius Walewski died. He had outlived the world that once gave him purpose, and his passing marked the quiet end of an era in Marie Walewska's life. With his death, the last formal tie to her first, imposed identity dissolved completely. Marie was not yet 30. She had survived empire, scandal, political manipulation, and moral compromise. She had been a symbol, a tool, and a secret. Now, for the first time, she existed outside the machinery of power. It was in this strange calm that she allowed herself something she had never fully chosen before. Love. Count Philippe Antoine d'Ornano had been in her life for years, on the margins, never urgent, never imposed. He was a French soldier, a general of Napoleon's army, and ironically, Napoleon's cousin. He had witnessed the rise and fall of the empire from the inside, and he carried its scars with a quiet dignity, unlike others. D'Ornano did not demand anything from Marie. He did not frame her as a symbol of Poland. He did not see her as a political bridge. He did not need her sacrifice. He saw her as a woman who had endured too much. Their relationship unfolded without secrecy or calculation. There was no empire to please, no nation to save, no future to negotiate. In 1817, they married and settled in Liège, in what was then the Austrian Netherlands. For a brief moment, Marie's life became almost ordinary. She was a wife by choice, a mother without pretense, a woman allowed to rest. She soon gave birth to another son, Rodolphe Auguste. The child arrived not as a complication, but as a continuation, a quiet affirmation that life persisted even after history moved on. But Marie's body had paid its price. She had suffered from kidney illness for much of her life, a condition worsened by years of stress, childbirth, and emotional strain, just 6 months after giving birth. On December 11, 1817, Marie Walewska died. She was 31 years old. There was no grand spectacle, no political consequence. No empire reacted to her death. She passed as she had lived, largely unseen by the world that once depended on her presence. She was buried in Paris, far from the Polish soil she had loved so fiercely. Later, her remains were returned to Poland, as if history, belatedly, sought to give her back what it had taken in the years that followed. Marie's life refused to fade completely. Her sons grew into men of consequence. Rodolphe Auguste became an important political figure during the Second French Empire under Napoleon III. Alexander, Napoleon's son, rose even higher, serving as foreign minister of France and negotiating peace at the end of the Crimean War. The bloodlines of empire continued through her, long after her voice had been silenced, before her death. Marie completed her memoirs. In them, she attempted to explain herself, to history, to Poland, perhaps to herself. She framed her choices as sacrifice, her actions as necessity. Whether this was truth or survival narrative remains unresolved. That ambiguity is her legacy. Was Marie Walewska a patriot who gave herself to history, a victim of a world that traded women like currency, or a strategist who understood power better than those who claimed to wield it? The answer is uncomfortable because it may be all three. Her story resists clean judgment. It forces a question modern audiences still struggle with. How much of yourself are you willing to lose to change the world? Marie Walewska did not conquer nations. She did not command armies. She did not write laws, but for a brief moment. History bent around her, and when it moved on, it left her behind, changed, exhausted, and mortal. That is not a love story. It is something far more unsettling. It is the story of what power demands and what it discards. History rarely ends when a life does. For Marie Walewska, death did not close the story. It rearranged it. When she died in December 1817, Europe had already moved on. Empires had fallen and been rebuilt. Borders had shifted yet again. The Congress of Vienna had restored old monarchies and buried revolutionary dreams under layers of diplomacy. Poland, once more, existed only as a concept negotiated by others. Marie's passing caused no political tremor. There were no proclamations, no public mourning beyond family and close acquaintances. She was remembered privately, spoken of cautiously, as one speaks of a life that resists simple interpretation. And yet, her influence did not disappear. It resurfaced quietly, years later. Through men who carried her blood, her sons grew up in the long shadow of two worlds, the fallen Napoleonic Empire and the restored conservative Europe that followed it. They inherited neither crowns nor thrones, but something more durable: access. Alexander Florian Joseph, the son born of Napoleon, would become one of the most powerful men in mid-19th century France. His resemblance to the emperor became unmistakable with age, and in 2013, DNA analysis would confirm what history had long suspected. But even without proof, his trajectory told the story clearly. He served as foreign minister under Napoleon III, the emperor's nephew. He negotiated treaties. He shaped diplomacy. He helped define Europe's balance of power. after the Crimean War. The son of a woman history once reduced to a footnote was now writing history himself. Rodolphe Auguste, Marie's youngest son, also rose within French political life during the Second Empire. He did not wield the same influence as Alexander, but his presence confirmed something undeniable. Marie Walewska's legacy endured not through scandal, but through continuity. Ironically, the very systems that once used her now depended on her descendants. Her memoirs, completed shortly before her death, became a quiet battlefield of interpretation. In them, Marie attempted to reclaim authorship over her life. She described her relationship with Napoleon as sacrifice, necessity, duty to Poland. She minimized emotion. She emphasized restraint. Some historians accepted this framing. Others challenged it. They pointed to contradictions: her willingness to reunite with Napoleon years later, her choice to travel to Elba, the warmth preserved in letters. They argued that Marie's later explanations were less confession than defense, a way to survive judgment in a world eager to condemn women more harshly than emperors. The truth remains unresolved. Perhaps Marie loved Napoleon. Perhaps she endured him. Perhaps she did both, at different moments, for different reasons. What is clear is this: she understood power long before she touched it. She lived in a world where men ruled through violence and decree, and women were expected to absorb consequences quietly. Marie did not overthrow that system. She navigated it with intelligence, patience, and cost. Her life exposes an uncomfortable reality of history: that influence does not always belong to those who sign treaties or lead armies. Sometimes it belongs to those positioned close enough to power to bend it, slightly, temporarily, and at great personal expense. Marie Walewska did not save Poland. She did not stop empire. She did not escape unscarred, but she forced history to acknowledge her presence. That alone unsettles the narrative. She was not a heroine in the traditional sense. She was not a villain. She was a woman caught at the intersection of ambition, nationalism, and survival, who paid for relevance with her body, her reputation, and ultimately, her life. In 1937, Hollywood would turn her story into romance. Greta Garbo played her on screen, wrapped in glamour and longing. The film softened edges, reshaped motives, and offered audiences what they preferred: a love story. History offers something far less comfortable. Marie Walewska's life asks a question that remains unanswered even now. When a nation is desperate, when power is absolute, and when choice is an illusion, what does consent really mean, and who gets to decide how a woman's sacrifice is remembered? Her story endures not because it is inspiring, but because it is honest in its cruelty. History did not reward Marie Walewska. It used her. It remembered her selectively, and it moved on. That, perhaps, is the most truthful ending of all. Time has a way of sanding down inconvenient truths. In the decades after Marie Walewska's death, her story did not disappear. It transformed. Each generation reshaped her into something it could tolerate. For some, she became a romantic heroine, elevated by proximity to Napoleon. For others, she was reduced to a cautionary tale, a woman whose virtue had been compromised in exchange for political favor. Rarely was she allowed to exist as she truly was: conflicted, constrained, and conscious of the cost. The Duchy of Warsaw, the political miracle so often linked to her name, did not survive Napoleon's fall. At the Congress of Vienna, Europe's great powers dismantled it with bureaucratic efficiency. Poland was once again partitioned, absorbed, and silenced. The dream that had justified Marie's sacrifice dissolved into diplomatic language and signatures. This reality complicated her legacy. If Poland was not saved, then what had her sacrifice achieved? For Polish nationalists, The question was painful. To admit that the duchy had been temporary was to confront the fragility of hope itself. Some elevated Marie into a symbol of resistance, proof that even in defeat, Poles had forced history to pause and acknowledge them. Others preferred not to speak of her at all, uneasy with the implications of a nation's fate resting, even partially, on a woman's body in France. The narrative shifted differently. There, Marie was often framed in relation to Napoleon's emotional life, a footnote to his legend, a softer chapter in the story of a hard man. French historians debated whether she truly influenced his decision to create the Duchy of Warsaw, or whether her role had been exaggerated by Polish sentiment and later Romanticism. The debate itself revealed a deeper discomfort. If Marie mattered, then power was not as cleanly masculine as history preferred to believe. Her memoirs became central to this tension, written with restraint and careful justification. They offered Marie's own interpretation of her life. She emphasized duty over desire, necessity over emotion. She framed her choices as rational responses to unbearable pressure. Critics questioned her sincerity. Supporters defended her self-awareness. Modern readers recognized something else entirely: a woman attempting to reclaim narrative control in a world that had already judged her. Marie knew how history worked. She had watched it devour her father, her country, and eventually the empire that had used her. Writing was her last defense. Yet even in her own words, gaps remained. She could explain why she acted. She could not fully explain how it felt. Perhaps because some experiences resist language. Perhaps because honesty would invite condemnation she could no longer endure. What remains undeniable is that Marie understood the mechanics of power earlier than most. She grasped that nations were abstractions maintained by force, that empires were temporary, and that individuals, especially women, were often treated as expendable in service of larger myths. She did not romanticize this reality. She adapted to it. Her life forces modern audiences to confront an uncomfortable idea: that agency can exist even within coercion, and that survival strategies are often mistaken for consent by those who benefit from them. Marie Walewska was neither purely victim nor secret ruler behind the throne. She was something far more unsettling: a participant who knew the rules were unjust and played anyway, because refusing to play would have erased her entirely. That complexity is why her story endures. It resists moral clarity. It rejects simple judgment. It exposes how history prefers symbols to people today. Marie is remembered differently depending on who tells the story. In Poland, she is sometimes honored quietly, reclaimed as part of a national narrative of endurance. In France, she remains an intriguing shadow in the Napoleonic saga. In popular culture, she is still too often reduced to romance, but beneath every version lies the same truth. Marie Walewska lived at the edge of choice. She did not ask to become historical. She was made so by forces larger than herself, and when history no longer needed her, it let her fade. Yet in fading, she left behind a question that history still cannot answer cleanly. If power demands sacrifice, and sacrifice falls disproportionately on the powerless, then who truly writes history, the conquerors, or those they quietly consume? In the end, Marie Walewska cannot be measured by outcomes. Poland was not permanently restored. Napoleon did not remain in power. The Duchy of Warsaw vanished like mist under diplomatic sunlight. If history is judged only by what survives, then Marie's sacrifice failed. But history is not only built on permanence, it is built on moments, brief ruptures where the impossible becomes conceivable, even if only for a heartbeat. Marie Walewska lived inside one of those ruptures. She represents something history is deeply uncomfortable acknowledging. That power is not exercised only through armies and decrees. That influence does not always look like command. and that women, even when denied official authority, have always existed within the machinery of history, absorbing its pressure, redirecting its force, and paying its costs. Marie did not command Napoleon. She did not manipulate him like a strategist moves pieces on a board. What she did was more subtle and more dangerous. She humanized a man who ruled by abstraction. Napoleon thought in terms of nations, borders, and legacy. Marie forced him, briefly, to think in terms of people, of loss, of memory, of a country erased not by defeat, but by agreement. Whether that influence was decisive or merely contributory no longer matters. It existed, and it disturbed the clean mythology of absolute power. That is why history struggled to place her. To acknowledge Marie as meaningful is to admit that history is not purely masculine, not purely violent, not purely rational. It is emotional, intimate, and often shaped in private spaces history prefers not to illuminate. So instead, she was softened, romanticized, reduced, a mistress, a love affair, a footnote. These labels are easier than confronting what she truly embodied. Marie Walewska was a woman living under layered coercion, familial, political, national, and yet she still exercised intention. Her choices were constrained, but they were not meaningless. She understood that refusing to act would not preserve her innocence. It would merely preserve the status quo. So she acted. Not boldly, not loudly, but decisively. Her tragedy is not that she gave herself to Napoleon. Her tragedy is that history demanded someone do so, and then judged her for complying. She paid for male ambition with female consequence. She paid for national desperation with personal compromise. She paid for proximity to power with erasure once power moved on. And still, she endured. Her sons rose, her words survived. Her story refused to vanish. That endurance is not romantic. It is not triumphant. It is honest. Marie Walewska stands as a reminder that history is not only written by conquerors, but it is rarely kind to those it uses and discards. She complicates the narrative of heroism, forcing us to ask whether sacrifice is noble when it is demanded rather than chosen. She forces us to confront a harder truth. Sometimes history does not reward virtue. Sometimes it does not even reward success. Sometimes it only records who was willing to be consumed. Marie Walewska was consumed carefully, quietly, and completely. And yet, centuries later, we are still talking about her. Not because she was perfect, not because she won, but because her life exposes the cost of power more honestly than the lives of emperors ever could. That is her final judgment. Not mistress, not martyr, not manipulator, but witness. A woman who stood close enough to power to feel its heat, and lived just long enough to show us what it burns away. After the judgment comes silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows catastrophe. When dust settles and the world pretends nothing irreversible has happened. For most of the 19th century, Marie Walewska existed in that silence. Her name appeared occasionally in footnotes, memoirs, diplomatic correspondence, never central, never loud. She hovered at the edge of narratives dominated by men who conquered, ruled, and fell dramatically, compared to emperors and generals. Her life seemed small. That illusion is history's final deception. Because Marie's story does not end with her death. It ends with what remains unresolved. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as one of history's great men. His failures are analyzed, his victories are dissected, His ambition is admired even by those who condemn him. His exile is romanticized. His downfall is theatrical. Marie Walewska received none of that generosity. She was not allowed grandeur and failure. She was not allowed complexity without suspicion. She was not allowed ambiguity without judgment. History demanded clarity from her where it demanded none from him. And yet, when time stripped away myth and spectacle, something curious happened. Napoleon became a subject of debate. Marie became a question history never fully answered. Was she complicit or coerced, strategic or sacrificed, empowered or erased? The truth resists classification because it lives in the space history prefers not to examine. The private costs of public ambition. Marie's life exposes how power operates when it does not need consent, only compliance. It shows how nations outsource sacrifice to individuals who are then denied credit, agency, or absolution. She was asked to carry Poland's hope on her back. She was asked to carry Napoleon's attention without title or protection. She was asked to bear consequence without authority. And when history moved on, she was asked to disappear quietly. That she did not fully disappear is the only victory she was allowed. Her descendants reshaped Europe in subtler ways than cannons ever could. Her words survived long enough to complicate the stories told about her. Her presence continues to unsettle narratives that prefer clean lines between hero and victim. Marie Walewska does not fit into history's preferred boxes, and that is precisely why she matters. She reminds us that history is not only what happens, it is what is justified afterward. That power writes its own innocence retroactively. That women caught near the center of history are often remembered not for what they endured, but for what others needed them to be. Romance, scandal, symbol, anything but human. To tell Marie Walewska's story honestly is to admit something uncomfortable. That history often advances not on ideals, but on quiet compromises made by people with no good options. That empires are built not only with blood, but with silence, and that the cost of greatness is rarely paid by those who claim it. Marie Walewska paid that cost fully. She lived long enough to see her sacrifice become obsolete. She died before the world was ready to understand her. And perhaps that is the most truthful ending history could give her. No redemption arc, no final triumph, no comforting resolution. Only the enduring unease of a life that forces us to look closer at how power really works, and who it consumes to sustain itself. That unease is her legacy. And as long as history is told honestly, it will never completely let her go. Marie Walewska's story did not end in the 19th century. It only went quiet. And silence, in history, is never absence. It is postponement, because the questions her life raises did not belong only to empires and monarchies. They belong just as urgently to the modern world, where power has learned to disguise itself more elegantly, and coercion rarely announces its name. Marie lived in a time when power was visible. Armies marched, crowns fell, borders were erased with ink and blood. Today, power is often subtler. It hides behind institutions, incentives, expectations, and choices that are technically available but practically impossible to refuse. That is why her story still unsettles us. She forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. That agency can exist inside constraint, and constraint can masquerade as choice. Marie Walewska was told she had options. She could refuse Napoleon. She could protect her virtue. She could remain untouched by history. But those options were theoretical, not real. Refusal would not have preserved her innocence. It would have preserved Poland's erasure. Silence would not have protected her morality. It would have protected the status quo. Doing nothing would not have saved her. It would have erased her entirely. So she acted within a narrow corridor of possibility. Modern audiences, especially American audiences raised on narratives of individual freedom, often struggle with this kind of moral landscape. We prefer stories where choices are clean, heroes are decisive, and responsibility is clearly assigned. Marie's life refuses that comfort. She lived in a world where every available path carried loss. That is why attempts to label her fail. Calling her a victim removes her intelligence. Calling her a manipulator removes the pressure she lived under. Calling her a heroine romanticizes a suffering that was never meant to be noble. Marie Walewska was something more disturbing than all three. She was competent under coercion. She understood how power worked and adapted without believing in it. She did not confuse proximity with equality, nor influence with safety. She never imagined she would win, only that she might alter the direction of loss. That kind of realism is not celebrated in history. It is tolerated, then forgotten. In modern terms, Marie's story mirrors countless lives lived near power, but never within it. Advisors without titles, partners without protection, whistleblowers without immunity, caregivers, negotiators, intermediaries, people who absorb pressure so systems can continue functioning without visible fracture. They are rarely credited. They are frequently judged. They are almost always expendable. Marie Walewska shows us what happens when history asks an individual to carry collective hope and then denies responsibility for the consequences. She also exposes how narratives are weaponized after the fact. When her sacrifice produced something tangible, the Duchy of Warsaw, she was praised selectively. When it collapsed, her role was minimized. History adjusted the story to protect power, not truth. That pattern has not changed. What Marie ultimately represents is not romance, nor scandal, nor patriotism alone. She represents the hidden labor of history, the emotional, moral, and bodily cost paid by those who never get to write the official version. Her life asks us to rethink how we judge people placed in impossible positions, not what should she have done, but what was actually available to her. Not was she pure, but who benefited from demanding purity from her. Not did she succeed, but why was she the one asked to risk everything? These are not historical questions. They are present tense ones. Marie Walewska matters because she reveals the gap between moral theory and lived reality. Because she shows how easily societies outsource sacrifice and then pretend it was voluntary. Because she reminds us that history's most consequential decisions are often made far from podiums and battlefields, by people whose names survive only if we choose to remember them. She did not change the world permanently. She changed it briefly, imperfectly, and at great personal cost. And sometimes, that is the most honest kind of impact history allows. Marie Walewska does not offer inspiration. She offers clarity, and clarity, once seen, cannot be unseen. That is why her story still echoes, long after the empires that used her turned to dust at some point. Forgetting becomes intentional. History does not simply lose people. It selects which lives are inconvenient to remember. Marie Walewska belongs to that category, not because her life was insignificant, but because it disrupts the comforting architecture of historical storytelling. She does not fit neatly into triumph. She does not resolve into tragedy. She cannot be reduced to scandal without losing what makes her matter, and so she is softened, minimized, or quietly removed. When nations tell their stories, they prefer clarity, heroes who win, villains who fall, turning points that justify what came after. Marie offers none of that. Her life sits in the uncomfortable middle space where causality is blurred and responsibility is shared, but never equally. That middle space is dangerous to myth. If Marie mattered, then power was influenced by intimacy. If her sacrifice mattered, then morality was compromised for political gain. If her suffering mattered, then empire was not merely strategic, it was predatory. So history hesitates. Instead, it asks safer questions. Did she really influence Napoleon? Did she truly love him? Was she sincere in her memoirs? These questions are not neutral. They redirect attention away from systems and toward personal credibility. They place the burden of proof on the individual who had the least control, rather than on the structures that shaped her choices. Marie Walewska becomes a case study, not a consequence. Yet when we look closely, her life tells us exactly what history prefers to obscure. It tells us that proximity to power is often mistaken for privilege, when in reality it is exposure. That those closest to decision-makers are not shielded from harm. They are often the first to absorb it. That influence without authority is a liability masquerading as opportunity. Marie lived that truth. She was close enough to power to be used, but never close enough to be protected by it. When Napoleon fell, his generals were judged, exiled, or executed, but remembered. His allies were reorganized into new systems, but accounted for. Marie, by contrast, simply faded. No trial, no reckoning, no acknowledgement that her body, her reputation, and her future had been part of the empire's currency. That absence is not accidental. History rarely pauses to account for the people it leveraged quietly. It records outcomes, not expenditures. And Marie Walewska was an expenditure history preferred not to itemize. Yet even in forgetting her, history left traces, in letters, in memoirs, in the careers of her sons, in the persistent discomfort her story generates whenever it is retold honestly. That discomfort is the clue. Stories that disturb us do so because they reveal something unresolved. Marie's life unsettles because it forces a reckoning with how often moral burden is displaced downward, onto those with the least power to refuse it. She did not choose greatness. She did not choose notoriety. She did not choose to become symbolic. She was chosen, and that distinction matters. Marie Walewska reminds us that history is not only shaped by ambition, but by acquiescence under pressure, not only by bold decisions, but by constrained ones, not only by those who seize power, but by those who are placed in its path and forced to absorb its momentum. That absorption leaves marks. It shortens lives. It distorts memory. It complicates judgment. And yet, it rarely earns recognition. Marie's life ended at 31. Napoleon's legend continues centuries later. That imbalance tells us less about significance than about who history is willing to glorify. To remember Marie Walewska fully is to admit that history advances not only through brilliance and brutality, but through quiet compliance extracted from those who had no good alternatives. That admission is uncomfortable, which is why forgetting remains tempting. But forgetting does not erase the pattern. It only ensures it will repeat. Marie Walewska is not history's exception. She is its warning. Every historical era leaves behind a ledger. Victories are tallied. Borders are redrawn. Names of leaders are engraved into memory. What rarely survives is the accounting of cost. Not financial cost, not military loss, but human expenditure. The lives bent, spent, and quietly written off so history can claim momentum. Marie Walewska belongs to that unrecorded column. Her story closes not with revelation, but with recognition. Recognition that history, as it is usually told, is incomplete by design. It preserves outcomes while discarding the means. It celebrates results while obscuring what was required to achieve them. Marie was required by a desperate nobility who framed sacrifice as duty, required by an emperor who needed legitimacy as much as conquest, required by a historical moment that demanded hope, any hope, no matter the price. And when that moment passed, she was no longer required. That is the quiet brutality at the heart of her story. She did not fall in battle. She was not executed. She was not disgraced publicly. She was simply exhausted by history's demands and left behind when usefulness expired. This is how most historical violence actually works. It does not always kill outright. Sometimes it depletes. Sometimes it corrodes. Sometimes it asks for just enough, again and again, until nothing recognizable remains. Marie Walewska gave just enough. Enough of her youth, enough of her body, enough of her reputation, enough of her future. She gave without illusion, without triumph, and without guarantees. That alone separates her from the myths history prefers. She did not believe sacrifice would be rewarded. She believed in minimizing loss. That belief is not romantic. It is pragmatic. And it is far closer to how most people navigate power than history is willing to admit. In the end, Marie leaves us with no moral instruction, no heroic template, no reassuring conclusion. She leaves us with something more valuable and more unsettling. She leaves us clarity about how power operates when it does not need to explain itself. Clarity about how nations justify using individuals as instruments. Clarity about how easily sacrifice is praised after the fact by those who never paid it. Her life asks one final question, one history has avoided for centuries. When we tell stories of greatness, who are we leaving out of the frame to make them possible? Marie Walewska does not demand admiration. She does not request absolution. She demands honesty. Honesty about the fact that history is not only made by those who command, but by those who comply under pressure. Not only by those who rise, but by those who are placed where resistance would cost everything. Her story ends where it began, not with power, but with constraint. And that is why it endures. Because as long as systems exist that demand sacrifice from the few for the comfort of the many, Marie Walewska will never truly belong to the past. She will belong to the present, and that may be the most unsettling legacy of all. When a story reaches its final word, something still lingers. Not resolution, but residue. Marie Walewska leaves that kind of residue behind, the kind that settles into the reader's mind after the narrative closes, quietly reshaping how other stories are understood. Once you see her clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee the pattern she reveals, because Marie is not alone. She is one of many lives history touched briefly, intensely, and then abandoned. Her name survived because it intersected with an emperor. Countless others did not. They left no memoirs, no portraits, no debates among historians. They were consumed entirely, without even the ambiguity of legacy. Marie's partial survival is what allows us to see the outline of everyone else. She stands as a threshold figure between anonymity and remembrance, between agency and coercion, between private cost and public consequence. That position makes her invaluable to understanding how history actually functions beyond its official narratives. Her story also forces us to reconsider what impact really means. Impact is often measured in permanence, borders that last, institutions that endure, names that remain etched in textbooks. By that standard, Marie failed. The Duchy of Warsaw collapsed. Napoleon fell. Poland remained divided. But there is another kind of impact, less visible, but no less real. The impact of interruption, of delay, of forcing power to acknowledge what it would rather ignore. Marie did not save Poland. She made Poland impossible to erase completely. For a brief moment, Europe had to say the name again. For a brief moment, Poland existed not as memory, but as policy. That moment mattered, even if it did not last. History often pretends that only lasting change counts, but that belief serves those who benefit from endurance, not those who suffer during transitions. For people living inside those moments, temporary change can mean survival, dignity, or simply the knowledge that resistance was not entirely futile. Marie gave that, however briefly. Her life also reframes how we think about responsibility. She was not the architect of empire, yet she bore its consequences. She did not design the system that exploited her, yet she was judged as though she had authored it. This inversion, where those with the least power are held most accountable, is not unique to her era. It persists. Marie Walewska becomes a mirror held up to modern power structures, to workplaces that demand loyalty without protection, to political movements that celebrate sacrifice while externalizing risk, to cultures that praise resilience without questioning why resilience is required in the first place. Seen this way, her story is not historical commentary. It is diagnostic. It tells us where pressure accumulates. It shows us who absorbs it. And it exposes how easily moral judgment flows downward, away from authority and toward vulnerability. Marie did not ask to be exemplary. She became instructive by surviving long enough to be examined. And perhaps that is the quiet purpose her story serves now. Not to inspire imitation, not to offer redemption, but to sharpen perception. To remind us that behind every great moment in history lies a series of smaller, private reckonings, decisions made under duress, compromises struck without applause, sacrifices that will never be evenly acknowledged. Marie Walewska lived one of those reckonings in public view. We are still deciding what to do with that knowledge, and maybe that decision, to remember fully, without romance or dismissal, is the only justice history can still offer her.